Any adaptation, of course, is a huge challenge to take it from one medium to another, but especially something like Payback, which is about debt. So how do you turn that into a visual medium?
The question was, is it possible to root these stories in the earth in some way, in reality? And could we do it in a filmic way? And I thought if I could find the stories that kind of embody that indebtedness, that would be the beginning. If I could then figure out how Margaret fit into that, that would be the second step. And then we'd be in business.
When I proposed my subject to the Massey Lecture and House of Venezia committee that decides on these things ahead of time, apparently they went into a huddle in the back room in which they said, why is she writing about that? And how can we get her to write about something else? Because they thought that I was proposing myself as some sort of an economist, you know, that I was going to write about money and finance, and that wasn't the idea at all. But as soon as they saw my outline that began with the afterlife in ancient Egypt, they realized that it wasn't that. It was about how people exchange things and the set of balances that we all have in our heads. Writing Alias Grace, which is set in the Kingston Penitentiary, and knowing about 19th century thinking about prisons. Penitentiary, that word, reformatory. There was an idea in those days that you would go in to become penitent or even to become reformed. But the thinking around prisons is just, it's very old and very confused because we don't know what they're for.
We've had a lot of response to the fact of Conrad in the film, and I thought it was really interesting because he is there. I mean, first of all, he's a juxtaposition with Paul Muhammad, who is somebody who most people would, I think, more normally think of someone who would go through the justice system, and they wouldn't think of Conrad Black as that kind of person. And when we wrote to Conrad because he wrote a review of Payback in the Literary Review of Canada and had very interesting things to say about the book, but also about his own experiences of the American justice system. And when I wrote to him to say, you know, is this something that you think you might want to talk about? He said, I have many ideas on that. I think his point was that that system of justice is broken. And people that he normally would probably never spend a lot of time with, which he then did, he learned that it was broken by spending time with those people. I mean, Margaret, you said that he's a kinder, gentler Conrad, and I don't, because I didn't know him before, I can't say that, but, you know, maybe this experience has changed.
There's no question. And he's been writing fairly extensively about prisons and how he thinks they do and do not work. And his is an informed view. So he has an inside view. He's undergone a transformation, not the one that the justice system intended, but the other question that you have to ask about him is, who did he harm? Who actually did he harm? And if you follow the dollar, who benefited? Well, the people who benefited were the people who brought the lawsuit. After the Depression and the war and into the 50s, people were very frugal in those generations because they'd been through situations where you had to be frugal. It was respectable to have a mortgage, and it was also respectable to have a layaway plan. You put the money in first, and when you had laid away enough money for the refrigerator or the Chesterfield, then you got to buy it from usually Eaton's. But it wasn't them lending you the money. It was actually to their benefit because you were lending your money to them. But as soon as the credit card came in, and that came in the late 60s, early 70s, and as soon as the credit card companies guaranteed those cards, such as that if you lost yours, you weren't going to get stuck for it, then people really started running up their personal debt because neurologically, your brain doesn't recognize things you buy with a credit card as money that you've spent. So if you have a credit card, you feel as if you have that money.
In the blood feud situation, so let's talk about that kind of debt, because I just had lunch with somebody today that said, if my husband had an affair, I would get a gun and shoot him. Literally.
Who is that? I think the husband should know.
It wasn't just a sort of garden variety affair. It was an affair where deception had occurred over a period of 40 years. Anyway, this was the sort of the supposition.
So let me get this straight.
She
40
said,
years,
if somebody
and
did
she's
that to
how
me,
old now?
well, like, late 50s.
And she still is that interested.
Well, no, what I think is interesting is that we still have that completely direct capacity for immediate action or revenge in us, like that feeling of revenge. And in Albania, I mean, it is true that in southern Albania, in the cities, it's sophisticated and it's just like Europe, But when you go into the mountains, geographical isolation does something to people, and it certainly takes away a credible third-party justice system. So you're in a situation where the police aren't coming and nobody's going to kind of, step in. So how do you administer this yourself? It's not just an eye for an eye. I mean, Karen Armstrong pointed out to us that an eye for an eye, that lex talionis justice, in fact, was also a limiting
You couldn't do more
formula.
than
You couldn't do
yeah.
more than an eye. You couldn't take out 2 eyes for 1 eye. You could only take out 1 eye. I mean, so imagine that. But I just find it fascinating how quickly we get back down to the basics when certain things are threatened.
But there's also noteworthy historical examples of national debts just being written off. The other problem, of course, is that you have leaders of a country who run up these debts, take the money and run. They're pilfering from their own countries, but how do you manage to stop that? You would have to overhaul the Swiss banking system and safe asylum.
For somebody who didn't write about national debt, you have a lot to say about it.
I'm making it up. But so are they.